We proceed with fundamental motor skills, this time focusing on locomotion. In the previous module, we were introduced to the test of gross motor development 2. This is the primary assessment tool being used in schools. In fact, this is the mandated tool for Texas elementary schools. Kids are supposed to be tested in their motor skills. As exercise science students, you are to study the TGMD2 criteria for movement analysis. When it was first introduced in the previous module, it had to do with the object manipulation skill. The scoring sheets for the subtests are available in the module folder. You are required to download them. A separate sheet is for object manipulation and another one for locomotor skills. Here, obviously, this module 13 will concentrate on locomotion. You've been previously just introduced to TGMD2. However, from here on, it is assumed that you've downloaded the score sheets to understand fully the movement analysis process. This has bearing on the quizzes and the exam. Please do not forget to do this. It is important. This slide depicts the mountain of motor development. This is a review. This allows us to see things in perspective where we've been, and the next thing that we are going to tackle are the fundamental motor patterns. We've already finished analyzing object manipulation skills such as catching and throwing. We proceed now to the locomotor skills. Again, as a reminder, the idea is that you expect kids to be learning all these fundamental patterns within the first 7 years. As far as developing locomotor skills, walking occupies a special place on its own. If you think about it, the practice of physical therapy is hugely driven by the recovery of mobility in particular. It's the recovery of locomotion, particularly walking skills. As we progress, we go from walking to running to jumping to leaping, galloping, skipping, and hopping. There is an order to this. Let's proceed though, starting with the gait cycle. The analysis of walking has a template. When you analyze walking, say for example in Texas, the doctor who is looking at the gait patterns of a kid with cerebral palsy has to be able to speak to the doctor in Seattle in case that child moves to a different place, and you will quickly realize that there is a language to movement analysis in this case. It is called the Philipson gait cycle, pretty much is the standard biomechanical template to analyze gait. We begin with heel strike. Notice this is the darkened leg. The whole cycle of gait begins with a heel strike and ends with a heel strike. In between are event markers that you are to know wholeheartedly. This is the mid stance. The mid stance is achieved with a perpendicular placement of the leg relative to the ground. Obviously, there is a term for this, but for now, given the limited time that we have in discussing locomotion, I will only highlight the major events in the Philipson gait cycle. At some point after mid-stance is achieved, weight is transferred to the other leg, but that leg is not the one we are following. Again, as a reminder, we're following the shaded leg. As that leg transfers weight, it achieves this by generating ground reaction force as it pushes off. The minute push off is completed, that is the end of the stance phase. As the toe off begins, meaning the toe literally lifts off the ground, this is the start of the swing phase. This is the swing start. Okay? As the swing start begins, it also ushers that whole where the segment is at the mercy of gravity. At some point, swing ends and another heel strike is accomplished. That whole phase just prior to the heel strike is the swing phase. All in all, the stance phase takes up about 60% of the cycle, whereas the swing phase about 40%. In the middle, right as push-off happens, we have to take note of an event called the double support, double knee lock phase. Clearly, this considers the other leg as well, but for the benefit of the Philipson gait cycle, we are confining ourselves to these limited events. Unless you want to proceed to a career in gait analysis, obviously there is more detail that you have to cover than what is afforded in this module. Let us begin by looking at the gold standard. Assuming that we are looking at a healthy gait, what does the adult pattern of walking typically express? Foot contact. We talked about heel strike. The progression of weight starts from the heel and it gets transferred towards the toes. In the meantime, there is the midfoot stand somewhere in there. With respect to the configuration of the feet, take note of the dynamic base. Foot is placed on a straight line basis. Of course, there's deviations here and there. Some people prefer an out-toeing. Some people have a pigeon toe. Some people have a pigeon toe pattern. But bottom line is the step itself that ensues follows a narrow step width pattern. With regards to knee action, as heel strike is achieved, loading at ground contact begins. In other words, your knees serve as the shock absorbers. Weight transfer is achieved via the flexion of the knee. The transition to the other leg is achieved via the double support, double knee lock phase. At some point in the walking cycle, both feet are on the ground. Knee extension initiates push-off. This is where you generate the force by pushing against the ground. Continuing on with respect to the trunk is erect and the arms are lowered at the side, moving in opposition with the legs. But take note of a wonderful phenomenon when it comes to the gait cycle of a healthy adult. Think about how small 11 millimeters is. The toe clears the ground by such a small margin, and yet we do not see people falling all over themselves a lot. Of course, unless they're drunk or something else, some other pathological condition is present. As we look at the overall results, the gold standard is the adult walking pattern that is fast, smooth, flowing, and well balanced. In summary, all of this were discussed in the previous slides. This will be the basis of us comparing the walking patterns of infants and older adults. We will be using gait as a skill that crosses ages and stages. Literally, we're going to cover the lifespan. Therefore, we transition to the infant walking patterns. Unlike adults who hit the ground with a heel, the infants do it quite differently. Foot contact is not via heel strike. Instead, they hit the ground flat-footed. Dynamic base is characterized by out-toeing. Step width is rather wide. If you look at children, you will be hard-pressed to find kids walking with a narrow step width. Step length is rather short and rigid. Why? All in all, this pattern of no heel strike, if you just look at the behavior, and I'm sorry we can't look at a video right now, but the fact is the kid is almost marching as they strike the ground flat-footed. Their mid-stance is rather short because instead of progressing towards a push-off, they lift the knee off the ground. They start a marching pattern similar to what your soldiers tend to do in a parade. At ground contact, typically the child is in the process of abruptly extending the knee. It is quite rather rigid. At step initiation, there's a high knee lift instead of a push-off, and the swing leg is not as much allowed to swing with gravity freely. In other words, they don't take advantage of free energy. They have to literally intervene with muscular contraction. 80% of the adult walking pattern in the swing phase does not need any muscular contraction. In other words, the mature adult takes advantage of gravity. The infants don't. In some sense, the walking patterns of infants show some similarity to older adults. With respect to the trunk, The infant, along with that high knee lift, initiates the step with a distinctive trunk lean forward. They literally are falling into each step as much as they lift the knee, because that leg that's supporting the body at single limb stance, obviously they're not as strong yet, but they literally fall into the next step. The arms, unlike the relaxed swing of healthy adults, children place their arms on high guard, and there's a rigid swing that is associated with this. Toe clearance. The fact that the children are literally marching, expect a large toe clearance from the little ones. So, overall, children walk slower than adults, and this is not just in absolute terms. This has nothing to do with their height. There's a way of analyzing gait patterns where you normalize it based on height. After having done so, it's still evident that infants are slow relative to their height. The fact that they're literally marching and falling into each step, it is a disadvantage to the little, what we call new walkers. Let us proceed to the older adults. It's already been mentioned that they have some similarity to children, but the mechanism is quite different altogether. Like the little kids, they contact the ground flat-footed. However, unlike the kids who are marching, unlike the kids who have such high toe clearance because they're essentially doing a knee lift, the elderly, actually one can argue that they do not contact with the heel. Instead, they contact it almost grazing the ground because it's a shuffle. The dynamic base, this is similar for the kids, some out-toeing. Step width is also wide. It is evident that balance is an issue as much to the adults as it was to the children. As for knees, the disadvantage that the elderly have is a level of half flexion at the knee, partly because they want to stay closer on the ground, partly because of the aging effects on the inflexible joints. So what gives is that with this configuration of the knee, there is minimal spring-like effect. That push-off is abbreviated, unlike the normal push-off in the gait cycle of the adult, where they literally push against the ground and the ground pushes against them, taking advantage of that Newtonian law of action-reaction. The elderly do not quite enjoy that advantage. Along with that is an incomplete knee extension because, as we've already established, they are literally just grazing the ground. Knee lift, some knee lift is involved, but not to the extent where they can swing the leg freely. Like in children, the trunk lean initiates the whole stepping process. With the elderly, there's an addition of the head jutting forward, and part of the constraint in the organism or in the structure is the kyphosis. We're going to detail kyphosis in the next chapter, but bottom line, this is the curvature of the shoulder so that it is collapsing toward the front. Arms are mid to high guard. That's again similar to the children, and unlike the children, there is minimal toe clearance due to shuffling. The pattern is very clear, that of a slow, deliberate gait with very limited push-off. That summarizes pretty much everything that was brought about by these elements to the walking pattern. If you think about the balance issues that a lot of the elderly have, in fact, many of them are afraid to fall. Perhaps some of these behaviors are related to the compensatory strategies they start to take on. If you remember the mountain of motor development at the very tip, when we get older and kind of like Jenga, the elements are not as aligned, and at some point the body will start to compensate for what it perceives to be now a weakness or a lack, for whatever that means. Proceeding on to the complex locomotion patterns, we have to look at run. Run and walk are similar in the sense that it is a flexion and extension and alternating leg movements, but one definitive difference between the run and the walk is that the run has an airborne phase. Every landing for a run is on a single limb, whereas walking has that double knee lock, double support phase. Please take note. I assume that these terms are now ingrained in your lexicon. Jump follows the development of the run, and then leap and gallop, slide and hop. It is questionable whether gallop, slide, and hop develop at the same time, but in terms of complexity, this probably gives us brief picture of how we go from what we seem to think as simple skills all the way to the most complex ones. At this point, you ought to know the mechanical descriptions of each of these skills. You need to be able to resolve which description is appropriate for the task. When there is a step and it is chased by the lagging leg, and there is a 60 to 40 or 70 to 30 phasing. Though we do not have time to do a biomechanical analysis of the behaviors themselves, please take note. When we think of phasing, that is, clearly there's a lead leg in this skill, and there's a lagging leg. The lead leg will occupy 60% of the cycle, or could be 70, and the lagging leg will occupy, in terms of timing, about 40 or 30% of the task in order to complete it. So what should be the definition of this? Go to your book. I expect you to understand what this is. Next, take off on 2 feet, landing on 2 feet. This should be easy. Again, I do not expect to spoon feed you on this. Everything is described in your book. Get to know which skill this refers to. It will be in the exam or the quiz. Continuous jumping cycle on one leg. Note this is one of the series of skills where the performer is expected to exhibit continuous performance of the skill. Jumping on one leg once does not comprise this motion. It has to be, at least when the TGMD2, when that is being tested, the performer is required to do 4 consecutive jumps on this leg. A step and a hop with alternate lead legs tells you that this is a more complex skill because essentially it's a combination of a walk and a hop. Okay? On top of that, it's alternating lead legs. As you listen to this lecture, try this out on your own. Continuous cycle of alternating flexion and extension with a 50-50 phasing and an airborne phase. 50-50 phasing refers to the gait cycle, where as one begins the cycle, at time 0, the other leg is at 50% of the cycle. It also means that half the time of the cycle is spent on the right and half the time is spent on the left, except that it is offset. While one is beginning the cycle, the other is at 50% of the phasing. Unlike walking, this has an airborne phase, so that's a good clue as to what's being described here. Take off from one foot, landing on the other, with the stride length longer than that of a run. What skill is this? By the way, please take note. Number 2 and number 6 are skills that we call discrete. The skill performed is done in a nanosecond. It's done. Whereas number 1, 3, 4, and 5 are continuous cycles. Again, I refer you to the TGMD2. When we test this, when we assess this, they have to perform at least 3 or 4 cycles of this before they achieve criteria. Philosophically, do these behaviors emerge in a set order? If we think of where we have been as far as our theoretical driver for this course, dynamical systems theory says no. In other words, whatever behavior that kid shows, whether it's hopping, jumping, skipping, leaping, walking, running, one is to consider what the organism can or cannot do, what the environment provides him or not, and what the task was originally outlined for this performer. Remember the tripartite setup that Newell described at the very beginning of this semester. In this case, what is the weakest link at any particular time? That will be the determiner of the actual behavior. Weight, speed, force, and balance. do this start to influence the kind of behavior or at least the kind of performance the kids show? Let's start with comparing horizontal and vertical jump, for example. Which one of these two is the more difficult one to accomplish? And what could be the limiting factor in that case? It is your task to understand how the jump is accomplished, and there is, I believe there's one challenge in the discussion boards that will deal with this. Basically, when you're asked how many movement planes are involved, it tells you that one movement plane is a requirement for a vertical jump. You only need to go up. Whereas for the horizontal jump, on top of going up, you need to go out. So up and out. So will that answer the first question? Which one is easier? If you chose the easier one being the vertical jump, you are correct. The kid has to only think about going up. But at some point, you will notice this when you're testing kids for horizontal jump. That's why in TGMD2, what's being tested is the horizontal jump, the more difficult skill. They have to be able to lift off the ground, but they have to also go forward on top of going up. In this case, which involves greater interlimb coordination? The jump is actually an easier movement to analyze because essentially you have symmetrical movements on the right and the left. Everything that the right hand side does, the left hand side does too. So in that sense, in this case, the cooperation between the arms and the legs are what constitutes interlimb coordination. Given that the horizontal jump requires you to go forward, the thrust that the arms provide will be very critical. So, as far as analyzing the jump, I encourage you to break down the task. The way we broke down the task for catching and throwing, what are the components? This will be discussed in the challenges in the discussion board. I suggest you go participate in that one. So, let me clarify a number of things where coordination is involved. For which skill is this type of coordination most critical? Intralimb coordination versus interlimb coordination. Intralimb coordination suggests that all the coordination that needs to be done is within the limb. Let's take the jump as an example. How in that limb, for the legs, for example, if you are to break down the task as far as the preparatory phase, the takeoff phase, and the landing phase, and just concentrating on the legs, everything that has to do with coordinating the thigh with the leg and the ankle and the foot segments, all of those comprise what intralimb coordination means. Since the right and left hand sides are doing exactly the same thing, the burden of intralimb coordination is all that is needed to be able to perform a takeoff. However, there is an element of interlimb coordination because in a jump, you still need to be able to coordinate the arms with the legs this time. As you lead into more complex tasks, such as the hop is a bit more complex because you have a phase where you are relying on a single limb to support total body weight. On top of that, you have to complete the cycle at least 4 times, at least in terms of TGMD2. Question here is the hop a litmus test for skillfulness? What I want you to do is to look at how this kid performs the hop. In the process of viewing her performance, think in terms of interlimb and intralimb coordination. Why the hop is a difficult skill and why, in essence, it is a good litmus test for skillfulness. Did this child finish a full cycle of hop as we described it? My assumption is you answered the earlier questions as to the proper description of a hop. Let me play that again. The hop is a continuous cycle on a single limb. Was she able to complete this 4 cycles one after the other? Please take note, this is one of the kids that we were buzzing in from the other side of town in Lubbock. There was a program that was dealing with kids who are at risk for obesity. And your heart goes out to these kids because they cannot perform the task very well. Clearly the limitation of the organism, their body construction. This is a kid She's about 6 years old at that time. I can't estimate the weight at this point, but she is obviously having a hard time performing the task given the weight that has to be supported by one leg. As far as assessing locomotion skills, may I remind you of the TGMD2 by Ulrich. This is the Test of Gross Motor Development, second edition. The subtest for the locomotion skills involves 6 patterns: run, gallop, slide, hop, jump, and leap. Notice there is no skip there. Okay, there is no skipping skill. I do believe they're revising the TGMD2. TGMD3 should be coming out, if not this year, next year. We did define skip in one of those descriptions in the previous slide. As a reminder, the scoring for each criteria of the components are done on the basis of all or nothing. Either they did it or they didn't. If the criterion is fulfilled, you're given a score of 1. If it falls short, regardless of how some elements may be there, you get a 0. As a reminder, the TGMD2 is being used by teachers in the field, PE teachers who do not have as much time to analyze and assess each kid one by one. It's one of those things that is designed so that the school teachers can do this within probably about 20 minutes per kid. This ends the module on locomotor skills.